everyone, it's Rachel here, and with pumpkin season in full swing, I only thought it would be appropriate to make 3 different pumpkin bread recipes and figure out which one is indeed the best. So we will be making 3 different recipes from 3 different bakers. The first recipe is from New York Times by Melissa Clark. It is a brown butter and bourbon pumpkin bread. Then we'll follow it up with Bon Appétit's pumpkin bread recipe by Molly Baz. Lastly, we'll finish it off with a pumpkin bread by Yossy Arefi. This is an olive oil pumpkin bread with a maple olive oil glaze on top. These are all unique and sort of unusual takes on pumpkin bread. They all have something a little bit different about it that I think really elevates it from your average pumpkin bread. So first we'll start out with the New York Times recipe by Melissa Clark. This recipe is really unique because when you mix together the dry ingredients, you actually add a cup of whole wheat flour in addition to your regular flour. This addition makes the bread more like a bread almost. It's like a denser texture, it's a bit chewier, a little drier. This recipe also stands out quite a bit because, like the title suggests, it includes brown butter but also bourbon. So I will be honest, I did not have bourbon at my house. I'm not a huge drinker, but I did have apple cider, and that is a potential substitute for this recipe, so I swapped it out with some apple cider. So the key differences in the New York Times recipe is that addition of whole wheat flour, the brown butter, and the bourbon/apple cider. The New York Times recipe definitely came together with the thickest batter compared to all the other recipes that I made. The batter was really chunky, especially when I loaded it up into the loaf tin. It was like really holding its shape. So honestly, the New York Times recipe was not one of my favorites. It was the driest and was crumbly in texture. It was just not moist. The pumpkin spice flavor was not very strong, and maybe I should have used bourbon because I didn't taste any apple cider at all within that recipe. It was definitely just dry and not that impressive. It resembled more of a bread, while the other recipes were more like a cake and tender and moist to kind of bite into. Whereas the New York Times recipe was dry, crumbly, and honestly I was just not impressed overall. Okay, so now let's talk about the next recipe, which is Molly Baz's pumpkin bread from Bon Appétit. This recipe was actually really interesting because it required a few different ingredients compared to a lot of traditional pumpkin bread recipes that I typically see. Instead of ground ginger, I actually grated fresh ginger to toss into this recipe. Not only was there fresh ginger, we also used an olive oil base, which is what we actually will use in Yossy Arefi's recipe as well. But I love the addition of olive oil. I think it adds this like level of complexity and this subtle taste into the recipe that just infuses the pumpkin bread with like something really, really tasty, and I think it's a great addition. The other difference to this recipe is that it actually uses a whole 15-ounce can of pumpkin puree, whereas in the other recipes I was typically using about like 1 cup or half a can of pumpkin puree. So this recipe was like jam-packed and filled with pumpkin to the brim. And the last thing with this recipe is that it has a fun topping made of sugar and pepitas, or toasted pumpkin seeds. I love that little extra crunch of sugar and the toasted seeds on top. I think it added a little bit of a textural variety into the pumpkin bread. This recipe also required a lot of oil, and I think that's what makes it so moist and tasty to bite into. So the Bon Appetit recipe had a couple unique factors going for it, from the freshly grated ginger, the use of olive oil, as well as the pumpkin seed topping. I also want to say it's like the most massive loaf. I put it into a 9x5 loaf pan, and it definitely rose the most. And you bake it kind of like slow and low. It's at 325 degrees Fahrenheit for about 1.5 hours. So it definitely takes a decent amount of time compared to all these other recipes, which are around the 1 hour mark. And last but not least, we have a recipe by Yossy Arefi. I actually found out about this recipe because she did a collaboration with Claire Savitz on Claire's channel, and they made this pumpkin bread recipe and it looked so good I knew I had to give it a go. So Yossy's recipe is similar to the Bon Appetit recipe in that it leverages olive oil, and I love that as a base, and I feel like moving forward this is going to be the only way I make pumpkin bread with olive oil. She also includes a few grinds of fresh black pepper into her recipe, which I think is very different and unique. It's not something I've ever really heard of before, so it makes it a bit more interesting compared to some of the other recipes I've seen. And lastly, her recipe includes a glaze made with maple syrup and olive oil, and this glaze kind of just goes over the top of the pumpkin bread, and then you sprinkle it with pumpkin seeds as well as flaky sea salt, which I personally feel like is a complete game changer. The addition of the flaky sea salt really just adds that touch of like sweet and savory, and I think it makes the pumpkin bread even more delicious because it brings out the olive oil flavor in the icing and in the cake, and it just like mixes things up a little bit. Your tongue isn't really expecting it. Kind of like when you eat a chocolate chip cookie topped with flaky sea salt, you're like, wow, like that's just so good. So it works just like a charm on this recipe. So now I've got a slice of pumpkin bread from each of these recipes right here, as you can tell. I'm gonna do a quick taste test to let you know which one is the best. We're gonna go ahead and start with the New York Times bourbon and brown butter pumpkin bread. So as you can see here, it's definitely the densest of the bunch. It's a little bit dry when I touch it and it feels very solid, but I think this might be because of the whole wheat flour. It gives it a little bit more structural integrity. Oh yeah, very dry. Oh, it gets better. Well, this is definitely one of the driest pumpkin breads I've ever eaten. It's not terrible. As you continue eating it, I feel like you get to the center of the bread and taste a little bit better. But overall, it definitely lacks a lot of spice and flavor. I think this might be because I didn't use bourbon. Maybe bourbon is the better way to go for this pumpkin bread. I swapped it out with apple cider, like I mentioned, which may be milder in flavor and doesn't have a strong taste. I have to say this is not great. I can taste the whole wheat flour, which I think adds to the dryness a little bit. So far, in terms of like density, it's the most dense, it's the least moist, and really lacks any pumpkin spice flavoring. So these are the three metrics I'm going by. And unfortunately, it scores very low on all of these. I will list numbers here, but so far, not too impressed. Okay, now let's dig into the Bon Appetit recipe by Molly Baz. This is her pumpkin bread recipe. It also comes with a salted maple cream, but I actually did not make that, so we're just gonna stick to the pumpkin bread to fairly assess all of these various pumpkin breads. This loaf was definitely, like I mentioned, the most massive. It also has a sugary pepita topping, which I'm excited to try out as well. This recipe is super tasty. I just took one bite. It's packed with so much flavor, and if you can't tell, it's super orange as well compared to the other pumpkin breads because it contains one entire can of pumpkin puree, while the other recipes only contained about like 1 cup of pumpkin puree. It's also probably one of the moistest pumpkin breads I've had, especially coming from that really dry one by New York Times. And I love the crunchy sugary topping. It definitely adds a textural element to it. Overall, super happy with the moistness on this, as well as the pumpkin spice flavoring, as well as the density. It's lofty, it's a little bit more cake-like, and it's not as dense as the New York Times recipe. Oh, and I can also taste the fresh ginger. It adds just the right amount of spice and a little bit of kick to it. So I'm definitely impressed. Okay, now let's do the last one, which is Yossy Arefi's, and it comes with a beautiful glaze on top. So this loaf isn't quite as massive as the Bon Appetit one, but it still looks really great. It's got great structural integrity and crumb as well, and the glaze honestly makes this cake look the prettiest, I think, by far, compared to all the other pumpkin breads I made. Just one bite into Yossy's pumpkin bread, I'm kind of blown away, honestly. It's so tasty. I really got a good bite of that icing, and I think the icing is like the perfect balance to this pumpkin bread. It's not too sweet, which I know every Asian parent is always wondering, like, is this treat too sweet? I think the addition of the flaky sea salt, like I mentioned, is the perfect touch. You've got the crunchy pepitas, and the bread itself is like moist, but not too fluffy, not too spiced. It's very perfect. It's got all the elements of a delicious pumpkin bread. I want to say the addition of the glaze is a must. I know it's an optional add-on, but I would definitely suggest doing that, as the salt really balances out the sweetness. And now let me announce the winners and my favorites from this taste test. So in third place, I don't think this will be any surprise, is New York Times' brown butter and bourbon pumpkin bread. Unfortunately, it just didn't work for me. It was too dry, too crumbly, the texture was off. I did not enjoy this pumpkin bread at all. In second place, we have Molly Baz's Bon Appetit recipe for pumpkin bread. I think it was a lofty, moist pumpkin bread, and the addition of fresh ginger really brought out the spices in that loaf. And in first place, my favorite pumpkin bread loaf was Yossy Arefi's. It was a delicious pumpkin bread with a perfect glaze balanced with olive oil, sea salt, and a little bit of crunchy pumpkin seeds. I think that loaf just blew it out of the water. I think it's so unique, and the glaze made it also the prettiest loaf to look at as well. It had the density, the moistness, the texture, everything that I wanted, and I think it's definitely a recipe worth trying at home, and it actually had the shortest bake time compared to all the other recipes. It took about 35 minutes to bake, which I think was pretty good in comparison to an hour and a half or an hour. You know, when you want pumpkin bread, you kind of want it instantaneously, so this recipe is definitely the go-to for that. And so with that, that is a wrap on trying 3 different pumpkin bread recipes, taste testing which one is the best. If you all try any of these recipes, let me know down below in the comments. Maybe there's another pumpkin bread recipe that I need to try. Let me know. I love trying out these unique takes on pumpkin bread. I think they're all kind of great in their own way, but definitely give Yossy's recipe a go. Thanks so much for watching this week's video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. I will see you next week with an all new one. Bye everyone.